Well, the Alberta Heritage Fund has been around a long time and it dates back to the Premier Lougheed era with the hopes of saving for the future and diversifying our economy. But it sure got raided a lot in those lean times, and it makes you wonder if we should have bitten the bullet and just kept it growing. So joining us today to discuss this further is Tegan Hill. She is the Director of Alberta Policy for the Fraser Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank. Tegan, great to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So Tegan, you recently co-authored a study entitled An Alberta Dividend, the Key to Growing the Heritage Fund. So what is the UCP government hoping to do with the Heritage Fund?
Well, the Alberta government has committed to growing the Heritage Fund to between 250 to $400 billion by 2050. That's a worthy goal, but we know based on the history of the Heritage Fund that governments have a really hard time sticking to that commitment. So what we've done in this study is actually look to Alaska. They've had a lot more success growing their fund, and part of that comes from using a dividend.
Yeah, right. So how much money do we have currently in our fund?
We're maybe 23 billion projected for this year, somewhere around that. For context, well, let's use the same years. So when we looked at the data in the report, up to 2022-23, the latest year of comparable data, the Alaska Fund was worth $78 billion in US. That's about $90 billion in Canadian. And again, that same year, we were at about 20 billion. So they've had a lot more success at growing their fund than we have here in Alberta.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. So your study obviously looks at the success that Alaska has had with its resource revenue savings fund, and you're suggesting that we could do something similar here in Alberta. So how large is the Alaskan fund now? You kind of just sort of mentioned it there, and how much of a dividend are Alaskan residents typically receiving annually from that amount?
Right. So again, let's talk USD. So we're looking at a $78 billion fund. The fund has paid over $30 billion to Alaskans since its inception, actually, which was the same year. It started the same year as Alberta in 1976. And on average, in inflation adjusted terms, Alaskan residents are receiving a $1,900 dividend annually.
Oh, wow. So how does Alaska do things? Like, do they have a mandatory percentage of oil revenue that the government is required to deposit into the savings fund no matter what?
Yeah, so since inception, they have had a constitutional rule that 25% of resource revenues have to be saved in their fund. They also have a rule that the fund has to be inflation proofed annually. And then they've had that dividend since 1982, which has really enforced and created robustness around those fiscal rules. Um, because Alaskan citizens can see how the fund's growing. It's reflected in their dividend. If it's not growing, they're going to be upset, and that creates that political pressure. What's interesting is that Alberta actually also had started with a minimum contribution rule, 30%, but it was statutory in nature. A statutory rule is very different from a constitutional rule, which has existed in Alaska.
Okay, isn't that interesting? So the Alberta Heritage Fund has gone up and down like a yo-yo over the years, and part of the issue is that various premiers have taken funds to top up budget shortfalls rather, in tougher economic times, right? So does Alaska have any rules preventing this?
Yeah, so again, a constitutional rule similar to the 25% contribution prohibits the government from accessing the principal of the fund. So the earnings are used to inflation proof, pay out that dividend, create that robustness around fiscal rules for the fund, that public buy-in that creates that political pressure to maintain the fund. And then it's paired with these really strong constitutional rules, which mean that the government cannot draw on that principle as governments in Alberta have done so often in the past.
Okay. Now, Tegan, your study says that the key to growing the Heritage Fund is the dividend. So what is it about giving citizens ownership shares of state resources that seems to cause proper management of the savings fund?
So when they receive that check every year, it's salient to them. That dividend is the return that the state is getting from its resource revenue is visible to them through that dividend. And then if that dividend falls, again, there's that visibility to know how the government's managing the resources. What does that look like? And so we know that it's been effective because the state has delivered dividends since the existence of the fund. It's even topped up the fund beyond what would be needed to meet its minimum contribution requirements in certain years to avoid having that dividend fall. What's interesting about the dividend is that it's based in statutory law. It is subject to legislative appropriation and veto by the state governor. But even though it's in statutory law, which again, and I can explain the difference between that and constitutional, but that's a much weaker fiscal rule, yet the government continues to stick to all of its commitments to managing and growing the fund because of that dividend.
Yeah, and of course, like we always like when we feel a sense of ownership over something, we're going to have our say in it, and we tend to take more caution if it's our own money that we're looking at. So yeah, totally understandable. It's an interesting system that they have there in Alaska, for sure. Something that Alberta should look into. Do you know if the province has looked into sort of adopting some of those methods that the Alaskan government has been doing?
Um, I know that it's been considered in an academic realm. I know that, we're not the first to look at Alaska as an example. Um, from this current Alberta government, I have not heard any conversation about dividends. We know again that Smith has committed to growing the fund to 250 to 400 billion dollars by 2050, but she's not going to be our premier until 2050.
Right.
That's why we need robust rules that ensure when the governments change, or even if, let's say, resource revenue declined in a year and the Smith government thought, oh no, we need more money for the budget. We need rules to make sure that that can't happen. You need to stick to those fiscal rules. And it will impose discipline on governments as well, which is really important because we don't have a lot of spending discipline for governments today. And that's a separate but very related issue. And the Heritage Fund could help with that.
Yeah. Okay. So if I understand correctly, the Alaska government does retain the authority to reduce or even eliminate the dividends for its citizens. However, it's interesting to note that it's never done this in over 40 years. So what does that tell us?
It tells us that there's a lot of political pressure to maintain that dividend. And that dividend is linked to the growth and success of the fund. So it tells us that that dividend is really, really key. And again, I think a lot of Albertans are familiar with the Heritage Fund, but they don't keep tabs on, is it 20 billion, is it 40 billion, is it X, Y, and Z, because they don't see each year what that fund is looking like. This dividend is going to tie the performance of the fund to people individually, and as rational individuals, you want a bigger dividend than a smaller one, especially right now when so many people are struggling with affordability. I think introducing this dividend, it could be very impactful at this time when I think people are paying even more attention to their pocketbooks. It could be a huge success in Alberta.
So if Alberta were to implement these rules for our Heritage Fund, how much would it grow and how much of a dividend could we potentially see in our province?
So it would, by this year, we could pay dividends of about 150 to $300 per Albertan. That's also assuming that we make contributions like Alaska, 25%, and we inflation proof the fund. Now, that's not a huge number. Over 3 years, it'd be $600 to $1,100 per Albertan, though. And if you look at a family of four, that's about $2,300 to $4,400 over 3 years. Again, the thing with the dividend is that it will grow from there, right? So eventually we could see dividends, and not in the too distant future because we have such significant resource revenues that are similar to the size of Alaska. That does make a big impact. And again, even today, I think a $300 check, people would start paying attention just because, again, budgets are so tight right now. So I do think it's still an opportunity to start today, and that it could, again, deliver really meaningful dividends to Albertans.
Oh, definitely. You were mentioning that the average Albertan doesn't know how much the Heritage Fund. So, with that said, is there a place that we can go? Is it public knowledge? If it's not, it should be.
Yeah, so there is typically data on the Heritage Fund in each provincial budget. You can also go to the Heritage Trust Fund. I don't know the exact website, but
Yeah.
you can look at the fund. You can look at the annual reports and all of that. And then in terms of analysis, FraserInstitute.org, we have several studies on the Heritage Fund looking at the issues it's had in the past, again, how we can resolve that, and so there is a lot of information out there. I do recognize, though, that an everyday Canadian, without having, again, that link to the fund financially, at least in a really visible way, um, it's probably not something they're going to keep tabs on. And that's why this could be so effective.
Yeah, exactly. It gets forgotten about for sure. Okay, so Tegan, I know your study doesn't deal with this question, but any thoughts on how favorable the public would be to these kinds of rules and whether the UCP or the NDP would potentially be interested?
It's tricky. We're not political commentators. I think based on rational individuals, like going back to the principles of people are rational, right? They're going to make decisions based on what makes the most sense for them, and the public opinion is what's going to sway the political decision. And so again, right now I think people are feeling the cost of living. I think that a dividend like this could make a lot of sense for everyday Albertans. And particularly the potential for those dividends to grow. And I think if it's supported by Albertans, then it's going to, I mean, it would make sense that it's then supported by political parties, but we're going to have to wait and see. Smith is going to deliver a plan this fall on how she's going to grow the fund to that amount. So we'll see if dividends is in the picture.
Well, I think realistically thinking, if you consistently put resource revenue into the Heritage Fund, does it mean that in the short term it reduces the money available for the annual provincial budget? So, that could mean spending cuts, right? So I think that's sort of a tough sell sometimes, especially if it's an election year, right?
Absolutely. That's the other side of the coin. But what I would say is that right now, Alberta's spending levels are too high. So our spending levels are based on one-time windfall resource revenue. We have historically very high resource revenue today, but we know that that can change in an instant, and then we're in a deficit. So we actually want and should, for the sustainability of provincial finances, the government should be getting spending more under control and actually reining in spending. So this policy would support that. But again, it is fair to say it would take a hit to the budget. We would now be allocating some resource revenue to the Heritage Fund. So you make a great point. Politically, I think that would have an impact, and that's going to probably go into the thought process of the Smith government.
Okay, so if viewers agree with this study, what should they ask their MLA and Premier to do?
To take a close look at how they can have a more successful heritage fund, to think about a dividend, to start talking about these types of policies, because the last thing we need is more statutory rules, which are effectively just promises. A statutory rule can be changed unilaterally by the Alberta legislature. So the government can say, we're going to commit to this, and then 6 months later they can say, we're no longer going to commit to that. So we need to be pushing for robust constitutional rules. We need to be pushing for a dividend. And we don't want to hear more of the same. We don't want to hear about the promises that have been made over the last 50 years that have failed. We need a new approach to growing the fund.
Very insightful. Well, thanks so much for sharing this with us today, Tegan. I learned a lot. I hope our viewers did too.
Thank you for having me.
Tegan Hill is the Director of Alberta Policy for the Fraser Institute, and you can read the study at fraserinstitute.org. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.